Hey guys, it's Doc Vinyl here again on Record Time. Today's going to be a big show. Today I'm going to attempt the discography of the Beatles. And yes, I'm going to give a couple disclaimers before I start. The first one is that this will be American releases only. And I'm not going to get into the UK releases, and I'm only going to do part one, which is going to stop with the Help album in 1965. So this is going to be all their early stuff. I'm going to give a little brief history. I mean, obviously, most of it's well-trod, and I'm going to talk about the Beatles. Now, the Beatles are a tough one to do because they're such an influential band, and everybody has their own personal relationship with the Beatles. Songs, including myself. And the Beatles were such an instrumental movement, a phenomenon of the 60s, and they really were very, probably one of the most famous bands in rock and roll pop history. By far one of the most influential, definitely. So, the band was formed in around 1958. There's a lot of common folklore about it. The original bass player was Stuart Sutcliffe, and he'd sold some art paintings to buy a bass, and he played with John Lennon and then George Harrison, and then Pete Best was the original drummer, and Pete Best's mother was I believe she owned a nightclub, and then they got a lot of gigs that way. So that was very interesting. Now one of the big influences on them was Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and that's kind of where they got the name. Originally they wanted to call themselves the Crickets, and then Paul McCartney, when he joined the band in around 1960-ish, said that's already been taken. So they went with the Beatles, or the Silver Beatles first. The Hamburg tour was mostly the Silver Beatles, and then they became the Beatles with various spellings. And then, of course, they became the Beatles by 1961-62. So their first hit was in England in 1962, which was Love Me Do in late 1962. And, of course, this was a time where there wasn't a lot of albums, where people were releasing singles. And, of course, the Beatles did that. And I'm going to focus on their albums, not their singles, because that's just a whole other genre. But we're going to look at that. And it was very interesting to see how they became a phenomenon, the Beatlemania movement, and all this craziness that took off. They became really one of the most phenomenal and top recorded artists of all time. And of course, only one else that would probably come close would be Elvis Presley. But this was really part of the early movement. And they were of course influenced by Elvis and by Buddy Holly, even the Beach Boys to a certain degree, and all the late 50s, early 60s music. And their early look was like the leather jackets and greaser look. And then their look was changed with the mop tops and the changed haircuts. And of course, they supposedly had the mod long hair for 1962, which really wasn't long, but it's interesting. So that's your basic background. I don't want to get too much into that because there are so many great documentaries on the Beatles and the formation and everything. I don't want to get into all that. I'm going to focus more on the discography and a couple of the intricacies of the different albums of the American releases, which I think is pretty interesting. But yes, so Pete Best leaves the band by 1962. That's when Ringo Starr starts. And then that's the Fab Four that we know of course, is Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. And that's the band and the Beatles that we know and love today. So let's get into the Beatles a little bit, and I'll start with their first album. Their first album was released in January of 1964. Almost all these albums in 1964, really, which is kind of interesting. Hottest band in rock and roll. They released so much material in one year. And of course, it was by Veejay Records, and it's called Introducing the Beatles. This came out 10 days before the next album that I'm going to cover, but we're going to talk a little bit about the first recording labels and what have you. Veejay was the first American company that had the rights to record the Beatles. Now, they only had them for like a year, not even, and they had their first album. Now, this was really the same as the Please Please Me album, which, of course, was released the previous year in Great Britain. And they, of course, the tracks are about the same. There's only 2 extra tracks that are on the Please Please Me album. This is I Saw Her Standing There, Misery, Anna, Chains, Boys, Ask Me Why, side 1. Side 2 is Please Please Me, of course. Baby It's You, Do You Want to Know a Secret? A Taste of Honey, great song, by the way. There's a Place, and then, of course, Twist and Shout, which, of course, really harkens back to their Greaser days and their covers and what was influenced them. But now, let's talk a little bit about this album. This album's very interesting, very highly collectible album. This is the original. And I'm going to show you the actual vinyl on this particular one because it's very interesting. This is the original, and the way to discover if you have an original Veejay is if you look closely at the album, the Beatles is above the whole. It's recorded here, and this is the original release. Now, they have different labels, black one, and there's one with color on it too, but to really determine whether or not this was one of the first releases, it's where the Beatles is, right here, above the whole. The Beatles after the whole, I have a couple others I'll show you that were, not copies, but they were just represses of the same album. But this is really one of the first original Beatles albums right here. This was the first album you would have got in 1964, January 10th, actually, in 1964. Great album. I'm going to confess, early Beatles is not my favorite. I do like it, and it's not my favorite album, which will be in the second part of the Beatles, which will include my favorite album. But this album, very good again, and this is the Beatles. Now, introducing the Beatles. Now, they also did an alternative album, which was kind of a collector's item called Songs, Pictures, and Stories of the Fabulous Beatles right here. And then this one, you kind of open it up, and it has the whole story of all Paul, John, George, and Ringo. And again, it's the same exact track listing as the album I just showed you before. And this was, again, Veejay trying to make more money off of the same album. And this was kind of like a little different. And you can see the Veejay label is a little bit different, as you can see right here. See, it's the colored label. But again, the Beatles is above the whole. And again, this was one of the original ones. And again, this is the same exact album as the other. And you would get this because the Beatlemania that was sweeping the country, people wanted different versions of the same album. They wanted the pictures. They wanted to know more about the band. And again, remember, albums were in their infancy at this time. So there was a lot of, people wanted a collectible. And they wanted something, they wanted to know, who's this new band? And of course, they had the signatures. And this was all really about the band, this new phenomenon. Who are these people? And it tells you, like, their stats, how tall they are, how much they weigh, what they do. It's kind of silly, but in today's world. But back then, this was like really the beginning of the pop rock idol scene. And again, this is really the beginning of that. So this album was released later in 1964, towards the fall, but it was really basically the same album, just released again, and Veejay again making money. Now, as I told you before, I was going to show you some of a couple of their albums they have here. These are 3 albums, again, reproduced by Veejay, which are all the same album. But these I wanted to show you they're not fakes, but they're like represses. And one of the ways you can tell that is that, again, like I told you, the Beatles is same label, but the Beatles is after the whole here, which is very interesting. So these are represses, really, and remember, they were making so much money. The money that was made off their singles and albums was really, exploitive behavior, business practices. But again, everyone wanted it. So, and you can tell by the albums. There's like the original album here. I'll bring back the original album. There's a shadow here, and then you can see the watch. And this is a crisper picture of the original one, the original Veejay recording. The other albums are not as crisp as you can see in this particular one. There's no shadow here, and the imagery isn't as crisp. But again, this is another version. Again, another one, and this has a colored label on it. And this is a Veejay, again, this is the Veejay Beatles cover album. Again, one of the main ways to find out is if it's an original is whether or not the Beatles is above or below the whole on the label for the Veejay listings. Because an original mint copy of Veejay, the original one I just showed you, tons of money. But these are kind of the other ones, which kind of interesting. Now, that's the Veejay recordings. Now we get into EMI Capitol, which only 10 days later, on January 20th, 1964, released, of course, the most famous of the first Beatles albums called Meet the Beatles, which I have one of the original copies. This is a great album. This has a slightly different sound track listing, as you can see from the original track listing here. Some of them are the same. This says I Want to Hold Your Hand, which is not on the original Introducing. This says I Saw Her Standing There, which of course was on the original VJs. This says This Boy. This says It Won't Be Long, All I've Got to Do, All My Loving. Side 2 is Don't Bother Me, Little Child, Till There Was You, Hold Me Tight, I Want to Be Your Man, and Not a Second Time. Okay, so there's definitely a different listing of tracks, and of course this is really a classic album too. Some people like this a little stronger. This is technically the second Beatles album in a US release. The difference is this is released by Capitol Records, and this is of course the subsidiary of EMI and Parlophone, which of course was released in the UK releases. This is important because we start to see there was legal wranglings because there was so much money that they made off the Beatles. They were just phenomenal sweeping the world, especially UK and United States, which were the biggest markets at the time. And the Veejay company only had the rights to the Beatles until I think October 1964, something like October 15th or something like that, I think, what I read. And then they could only release that one album, so they sold like over 1 million copies. So they made their money, trust me. But from now on out, you're going to see everything on Capitol, which is cool. And now this is a classic album, and of course this is really what really brings the Beatles into play. And of course I have the original Capitol release, which is on the rainbow label, as you can see here. And of course the Beatles up here, and then of course this is multiple printings. This is not the absolute first printing. It's probably one of the first 3 or 4. But again, remember, these went through multitude of printings because they were selling so many at the time. So very, very important and very interesting. I'm going to put on a little Beatles actually right now. Just give me a second. I'm just going to drop the needle on the Beatles. And so I thought I would drop the Beatles on one of my favorite earlier songs. And again, yeah, I just thought this is a mono recording, which is kind of cool. This is what you would have heard in 1964. I love the guitar work on George Harrison here. Oh my God. Classic Beatles. I'll turn it down. I thought I'd put a little Beatles, and he had to play something. I mean, come on. So we're going to put little Beatles down there. So, the next album that comes out, which is technically the 3rd American release, is called The Beatles' second album. To further confuse you, which is actually the second Capitol album, but the 3rd actual album because the Veejay album was the first one. This is called The Beatles' second album. This was a big hit. This has Roll Over Beethoven, Thank You Girl, You Really Got a Hold on Me, which was a very big hit, Devil in Her Heart, Money, You Can't Do That. Side 2 is Long Tall Sally, which of course is a cover. I Call Your Name, Please Mr. Postman, I'll Get You, and She Loves You. And again, this came out in mid 64. Again, these are all 64 releases until I tell you what the first 65 release is, which is quite interesting. The second album, very big hit, and this is an original release, as you can see, on a Capitol label. And I'll show you one of the original Capitols, which is a different label, which is interesting as a repress. But yeah, this album really, the inexhaustible thirst for Beatles albums. I mean, whatever they put out, people jump in it. Even if they had one extra song, they'd jump in it. Now, the other thing that's it's important to understand in 1964 was the fact that the Beatles were predominantly a single band. They were releasing lots and lots of singles. So the albums weren't as big. They were big for collections. So these were more like greatest hits, really. Because a lot of people were already familiar with a lot of these single hits because they could buy them on 45s. But again, these are all mono recordings. And of course, this is the second album for Capitol, but technically the 3rd album for U.S. releases. Now, the 4th album comes out, which was a soundtrack, and it's called The Original Motion Picture, of course, and this was in late 64 by United Artists. And this one's called Hard Day's Night. Because this is very popular. Different cover in England, of course, same with the other ones, which I'll cover over there as we go through them. A different album. And then this album has A Hard Day's Night, Tell Me Why, I Cry Instead, I Should Have Known Better, I'm Happy Just to Dance With You, and I Love Her. Side 2 is I Should Have Known Better, If I Fell, and I Love Her, vocals, which is, of course, the vocals version of the instrumental that was on side 1. And then there is Ringo's theme, This Boy, which is an instrumental. Can't Buy Me Love, which of course was one of the big ones, was the vocal song, the big hit off this. And then of course, Hard Day's Night. Again, very big hit. This is a very big album. A different cover. The Hard Day's Night album in the UK is different. I believe it's blue. It's a little different thing. And like I said, I'll probably do a UK all the UK listings too, different. But this comes out in, I believe, July 1964. Again, they were pumping out albums. Remember, they were doing a lot of singles, and as they did, they compiled them into albums. And this was a soundtrack for the movie, and the movie was very big. This was part of the Beatlemania movie, and this is really like the beginning of like rock videos. Like basically, Hard Day's Night's like a giant rock video, and oh my God, very big, and people couldn't get enough of it. And this really, really transformed them. Now, as Capitol went along, Capitol wanted to do their, this would be their 5th album, I believe. 1, 2, 3, 4. This would be their 5th album, technically the 4th album with Capitol. And this is called Something New. Okay? And this is very, very good. And these are all classic Capitol. There's a Capitol listing. This one has I'll Cry Instead, Things We Said Today. Very big song there. Anytime at All, When I Get Home, Slow Down, and Matchbox. Side 2 is Tell Me Why, and I Love Her, another big hit. I'm Happy Just to Dance With You, If I Fell, another big song, and KDM Gib Mein Dein Hand, which is, of course, is a German word, I Want to Hold Your Hand, which is sung in German. Very interesting. Something New is interesting because this is a U.S. release only. It was not released in the U.K. like this. It was another album released completely. So again, it gets very confusing. What was released in the U.K., what was released here. Again, they were single-driven, so a lot of the albums were different configurations, different track listings, and what have you. Again, the phenomenon of the Beatles that is very important with this, and when it gets to the next album, the sixth album and of the U.S. albums, Beatles 65, was the fact that the phenomenon. They were a different band. They really introduced a whole new style to the people, especially this country, and people were just hungry for more and more, and how different they were. And they were very different, and they were really one of the most influential bands of the time period. They influenced everybody, and of course, as you see, they were the first British invasion, and of course, they sparked the second British invasion, which comes later in the 60s. And you can see very important of their impact of what they did and how they did it and what the music they were doing. Of course, the producer was George Martin, who of course really produced the sound for the Beatles. Now, the next album that comes out, the last album in 1964, even though it's called, again, further confusing, called Beatles 65. Very good. This album, really good. Lots of good hits on this album. This has No Reply, I'm a Loser, Babies in Black, Rock and Roll Music, which of course is great, I'll Follow the Sun, Mr. Moonlight. Side 2 is Honey Don't, I'll Be Back, She's a Woman, and of course the song I was playing, I Feel Fine, which is a great song, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. Again, this album was released in late 64, but came out and they called it Beatles 65. Of course, various interpretations, but again, this is only a U.S. release. This was the U.S. released. Very big album, very popular, and of course, I Feel Fine being one of my favorite of the early Beatles era songs. I just love the compositional elements of that song, for me personally. But again, this is a personal thing. Everyone has their own Beatles thing. It's a very personal thing, how the Beatles impacted their life, how they collected, the collectability of the Beatles albums, the influence, and how many people have covered the Beatles. I mean, it's just amazing. Again, their music is just, in some ways, just, undescribable. And again, this was a very, very big album. This had a lot of big hits on it. And now we turn to the first album of 1966, which of course, for the United States, of course, was Beatles 6, which of course, the Beatles' sixth album, again, this really doesn't follow order, because I figure if you do all the Capitol recordings, you are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the sixth, again, more confusing, the sixth Beatle album, Capitol, but the seventh actual U.S. release. Okay, this has got the world's most popular foursome, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And of course, by 1965, there have been other bands that are coming out, of course, the Stones and other bands that, which I will do, of course. And they were, but this was really, what do they do on this? This had 8 days a week. This had Kansas City, Words of Love, Yes It Is. Side 2 is I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, Every Little Thing, What You're Doing, You Like Me Too Much, Tell Me What to See, Bad Boy, and Dizzy Miss Lizzy. This has a lot of blues and R&B influence on it. Very good stuff. This doesn't have all the big hits that the earlier albums had on it, but very important. Beatles 6 is very interesting because it's people are hungry in 65. Now, they release a lot of albums in 65 in the United States. In 65 alone, they released this album, they released the next album, Help, and then they release Rubber Soul late. All 3 of those albums, you just think of the recording time, how much time they were spending in the studio. So much time, because they were so lucrative for the record label to have these albums come out and the singles they were producing. And the Beatles were starting to take a change. By the time we get to 6 and then Help, you start to see a change in the Beatles, more musicality, a difference in change. Of course, that transitions into the period I will cover in the second part of this show, not today, of course, but that's when you start to get the new sound, which really starts with Help and really comes to fruition in Rubber Soul, which we won't cover today. But yes, this is a Beatles 6, very big album, very important and interesting with the blues, and they start to move away. Haircuts are changing, and of course, the hair's getting a bit longer, and they're starting to change. Now, with the success of Hard Day's Night, they would make another motion picture soundtrack, and of course, this is the U.S. release of the album, not the U.K., which is a different album. And this, of course, is Beatles Help. Now, this album really starts to showcase some of the musicalities of the Beatles. Okay, so you can see this is, of course, like the music soundtrack, and this is from the original motion picture soundtrack, Help. And this has a lot of great songs on it, as you can see right here. This has Help, of course, The Night Before. You've got to Hide Your Love Away. I Need You, Another Girl, Ticket to Ride, You're Gonna Lose That Girl. And again, really good. And this was a soundtrack. This really did well. The movie did really well. And of course, this was really following into the propulsion to what the Beatlemania and music and Beatles merchandising from bands. They really started all that, and very much they were one of the first bands to really have all of that creativity going forward. And really, it's very interesting with Help. Great album. This was my mother's original album she bought. Actually, America's Just Cool. It's kind of nostalgic to me. Again, the Beatles are so personal. Everyone has their favorite albums, their favorite songs, their favorite Beatles stories, how the Beatles impacted their life. It's just, and again, everyone's different. Like I said, this album's really, again, and I did it chronologically. I wasn't going to rank these albums. To me, it just doesn't seem to make any sense to really rank them. But like I said, I wanted to go through them and give you kind of a primer on the Beatles and their massive impact and how they influenced so many bands that came after. By 65, the first appearance of The Who, which I talked about in another show, and then you had the Rolling Stones, and then you had all these other bands that the second invasion, which really starts 67, 68 with the Cream, and all these other bands, and Traffic, and what have you, and you see all these different sounds. But what is interesting is that the Beatles are really the kernel, the beginning of all this reference and all this influence, and they really open the door. Certain stories. Now when we talk about the second half of the Beatles, we'll talk about some stories of their recording and how they overlap with other bands and the influences on other bands and other bands even influencing them, which was quite interesting. So let's recap, finish this one up. Again, 1965, Help. Again, I want to show you that one right there, so we can put that right back up there. And then late 64, early 65 release was Beatles 6, which technically 1965. Again, they did 3 albums, 65, 6, Help, and of course, Rubber Soul. Then the late 64 album, which was technically released in late 64, like December 64, but called Beatles 65 to further confuse you. That was the next one. Great album. Love that one. And then we got Something New, which of course was another 64 release, mid 64 release, and of course went over the tracks of that one. And then we have Hard Day's Night, their first real soundtrack movie, a big hit, kind of like a long music video, like I said. Very good stuff, again, very important. And then we get into the next Beatles album, which of course is the second album, which of course is technically their third album, to further confuse you, of course. That's what makes the discography of the Beatles so very difficult. And then, of course, there's the traditional, everyone consumed the first Beatles album, but the first Capitol release, which was released in January 20th, 1964. And this is the first Capitol release. That's why the other albums are listed and numbered from this as being the first album. But the true first Beatles album, as I've already told you, was Introducing the Beatles, which of course was Veejay Records, which I talked a little bit about, the different versions of this one. And then, of course, later in 64, they released the sounds, pictures, and stories of the Fab Four. So again, this was really kind of a collector's item kind of thing that people really wanted. It was really good. So, all right, so that's the Beatles early stuff. Again, not my favorite period of the Beatles. I do like some of their songs. I mean, it's definitely nostalgic, and I love the influence, and of course, at the beginning of the band and the kernel of their influences, their musicality, their rhythm and blues core, and what I talked about. But what I really wanted to talk about is get the Beatles going. So this is Beatles Part 1. Beatles Part 2, I will pick it up at Rubber Soul, my favorite album, by the way, and go right through Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's, and Magical Mystery Tour, and the White Album, and blah, blah, blah. We'll do all those. And, of course, those are the more famous albums, and they got more creative. And that's really, I decided to break it here because this is where the Beatles sound really changed. So, yeah. So, yes, very much so. And, of course, Meet the Beatles being, one of the big ones that everyone loves. So, again, and then Introducing. So, there's so much collectability with this. And, again, a lot of this stuff will be available at Max J Records. A lot of these albums are from Max J Records. So, if you are into the Beatles, you want to discover the discography of the early Beatles, a great place to go and start and look, and really great stuff. So, like I said, this is Part 1. I hope you guys liked it. And I will drop Part 2 in the near future. And, again, like I said, I wanted to split the discography, so I hope you guys liked it. And until next time, stay safe. And it's Doc Vinyl saying goodbye.